Well, it's 7 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started, and Cynthia will just continue to let people in as people come in. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jara Boteo, and I am a member of the Hard History Project, and we've partnered a lot with Historic Hudson Valley the last couple years to work on a lot of new projects that they have been doing the last, I don't know, how many years, decade, to really retell the story. Yeah, what were you going to say, Julia?
20. We'll get into it in the presentation.
Perfect.
25.
Yeah, that's awesome. But we've been working with them for the last couple years and have just really loved working with teachers and using all of the resources that Historic Hudson Valley has worked on to really equip teachers with amazing tools to teach hard history. So we're so excited to have you tonight. We're going to be talking about teaching slavery specifically with using the document-based question technique. So real quickly before we get started, just a couple things about Zoom. I know we've all been on Zoom a ton the last few years, and we want this to be a very loose, friendly environment. And also we want to keep it as least distracting for our presenters as possible. So if you have a pet or a child, that is great. We love pets and children, and we welcome them to say hello. If we could just keep our mics muted during the presentation, that would be great. At the end of our time, we'll have time for questions and answers. So what we'll do is if you have a question that you think of during the presentation, if you could just type those in the chat at the end. Depending on how many people we end up with, we might have time to unmute and ask a question, or if not, Cynthia is going to be in the chat room, and she will, I always say chat room like I'm on AOL in the 90s, but she'll be in the chat and she can answer questions. She'll also hold some questions at the end and read them. So yeah, so as we get started, I would love to just give our presenters just a few seconds to introduce us. So I'm Jara. Again, I used to work with Maureen at Learning for Justice, and I'm so happy to be in this space with her again tonight. And I also taught English and theater for about 11 years in the classroom. So, and I'll kind of be helping facilitate tonight. And I'll pass it over to Maureen.
Hi, I'm Maureen Costello. I worked with Jara, when it was teaching tolerance. Prior to that, I was a AP US history teacher for nearly 20 years, so I've had a lot of experience with this. I'm kind of retired now, but I love to do anything that has to do with talking with teachers, so glad to be here.
And then we have Cynthia. Cynthia, you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. I've been in education for about 25 years. So I love it. I'm just happy to be here and glad to be part of the team.
And then we have Imani.
Hi, everyone. My name is Imani Hinson. I used to teach in New York for a couple of years, and now I am down in Maryland as a history teacher, a high school history teacher.
We got Chuck.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chuck Ullestad. I teach AP US History down at high school in South Florida right now.
I love it. And then I'd also love to introduce Nicole.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Wallace. I'm the Director of Education at Historic Hudson Valley.
And then Julia.
I'm Julia Butterfield, and I am the K-12 Program Coordinator at Historic Hudson Valley, so I oversee the planning and implementation of all the programs and resources that we offer for students and teachers at our various sites, particularly Phillipsburg Manor.
And we'd love to hear from you all. I'm going to post a poll real quick that will just ask you all a couple questions. And then in the chat, if you want to just write in your name, where you're from, what you teach. This poll will just kind of give us an idea of your role and kind of what grade level you work in or what kind of space you're teaching in. Can everybody see the poll? Did it pop up? Okay, great. All right, I am going to end the poll, and I think that it should show the results. I don't know if that worked. Oh, try this one more time. Did everybody fill it out? That's so interesting.
I can see it now, Jara.
Oh, you can? Okay, great.
I don't know if anybody else can.
Do you
I can
want
see it as well.
to share with us? Do you mind, Nicole, just sharing with us what you can see? Because for some reason, I can't see the results.
Yeah, when you share it, you won't be able to see it. I remember that from the last Teachers Institute. I think everybody else can, but I will read it to you. It's a weird Zoom feature. So it looks like 62% of our participants are classroom teachers. 8% are museum educators, which would be probably me and Julia. And then 31% are other. In terms of grade breakdown, it looks like we've got about a quarter of the teachers here are elementary, a quarter are high school, 15% middle school, and then the rest are sort of spread across other grade spans, museums, or universities, or community-based groups. It looks like in terms of professional discipline or area of interest, 62% said history or social studies, 8% language arts, and again, another 8% for museum education, English language instruction, or professional development, or other.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, well, I'm going to pass it over to Julia, who's going to talk some about Historic Hudson Valley and then the Teacher Institute that Imani and Chuck participated in this summer.
Great. Okay. Can we see the slides? Just give me a nice, okay, thank you. So as I said before, I work on the K-12 programs that we offer at Historic Hudson Valley, and primarily these are based at our historic site, Phillipsburg Manor, where we have been interpreting the history of slavery in colonial New York for 25 years. So Historic Hudson Valley itself is a network of 5 historic sites in Westchester County, just outside of New York City. As I mentioned, we have Phillipsburg Manor, Van Cortlandt Manor, which is a site that is currently closed for sort of educational programs as we're doing an ongoing restoration project. But there we interpret the history of New York just after the American Revolution and the white and enslaved communities who lived there. We have Sunnyside, which is the home of Washington Irving, the author of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And then we also manage the tours at the Rockefeller Estate Kykuit and at the Union Church of Pecanico Hills, which has stained glass windows by Matisse and Chagall. So we're primarily going to focus on Phillipsburg Manor, as that's really what connected to the topic of the lesson. So Phillipsburg Manor was owned by the Phillipses. They were a wealthy Dutch family, and it was a 52,000 acre property in the late 1600s and 1700s, mostly rented out to tenant farmers growing wheat. At the center of the property, there was a water-powered grist mill that you can see in this photo that would turn all of that grain into flour. And we know that the people living at this site who were forced to work at this site were a community of enslaved people. And so they were the primary residents of the site. So they are really the focus of the history that we teach there. And this is on the screen, you can see an inventory that we have that was taken of the property in 1750, and that tells us the names of 23 men, women, and children. It gives us the ages of the children. It tells us there's a category of men not fit for work. And this is really sort of the guiding document of how we teach this history at Phillipsburg. This process began in 1998, but officially we sort of published our new reinterpretation in 2006. And in those intervening years, we received multiple NEH grants so that we could conduct extensive research. We also formed an African American advisory board that we still work with, and we've added new members. And over the years, we've developed programs for multiple audiences talking about this history. So expanding our teacher resources, expanding the field trip program that discusses this history. And then we launched a digital project, a documentary website called People Not Property. So we have a sort of particular framework that we use for teaching this history at Phillipsburg, and particularly with students. So we think that it's very powerful for students to use what we call microhistory. So the idea of studying a period of history through the experiences of an individual or a small group of individuals, right? And we're asking students to understand something, right? Very complicated. It's the history of slavery. It was a complex institution. It influenced the development of the New York economy, society, and that's complicated. But by starting with a talk, just looking at people, their individual experiences, their names, how this institution affected them, what they did in response, that is so powerful to help students understand what this means. What does slavery mean? And it is so natural to students to see this as being a story about people. And of course, this is a difficult subject. It's an emotional subject, particularly with young students. So we always want to make sure we're allowing them time to process this and to express if they're having an emotional response to this story. And to be very honest with them that this might be an emotional subject for us as educators too. We really center the work we do on the primary documents that we have about the site and our historic collection, but we always discuss the objects in the context of who used them. So when we're talking about, say, a butter churn, we don't say, this is how this object churned cream into butter. We would say, Dinah, who we know was an enslaved woman here, whose name you saw on the list earlier, was using this churn to make cream into butter, and this is how that worked. And of course, all of the objects we have at Phillipsburg were used by enslaved people. And we really want to emphasize individuality and autonomy wherever possible to really counter the narrative that I certainly learned about slavery when I was in school, which is sort of that all the enslaved people were just this kind of nameless mass of victims, and these other powerful actors, acted upon them. And they were individuals, and they played an active role in their liberation wherever possible. And we are honest with students that we don't know everything, right? And that we are still learning, that how we talk about these things is changing. It's certainly changed even in the 6 years that I've worked at Historic Hudson Valley. And of course, many times students will ask us questions that we don't know the answer to. And some of that is, an opportunity to be honest with them about the lack of primary sources about enslaved people. Where does that come from? Why is that? And really invite them to sort of think more like historians. So in addition to the on-site, we offer a number of field trips and on-site school programs. And we also have workshops for teachers on how to teach this history in the classroom, which is how we started working with Chuck and Imani, who you're going to hear from later, through our NEH Teachers Institute. And again, this is a way for us to really think about how can we expand this learning beyond what is happening on site. And so another big part of that is the launch of People Not Property in 2019. Again, not everyone will be able to visit our site, but also how do we extend the learning opportunities that are there for people who do visit the site? How do we get them to keep thinking about these topics to explore them more deeply? So I'm going to take you through People Not Property a little bit. To give you an overview, and then I have to switch what I'm sharing. Pardon me. Okay. So this is an interactive documentary website. It focuses on stories of slavery in the colonial North. Many of these are stories of the individuals at Phillipsburg Manor, and Van Cortlandt Manor, but we expand upon that in certain places. It is a multimedia site, so we have videos that feature interviews with HHV staff, some of our museum educators and experts, leading scholars in the topic. And it's divided into 4 chapters. So, and each chapter has sort of subsections. There is defining slavery, being enslaved, choosing resistance, and pursuing justice. And you can see, in addition to the videos, we have sort of like pieces that are read, so that sort of scroll through and explain certain topics that students can examine. And then we also have document explorers like you see here. So this again is the Phillipsburg Manor inventory. And you can see when you click on this, you know, these little pop-ups can explain a little bit more about what a particular word might mean. We also have a feature to look at a transcript of that, which in many cases is easier for students. And then we also have down here a glossary feature that would highlight a particular word students might not be familiar with and explain it. And then we also soon are going to launch a new digital history project, which is called Kofi's Fire. And that is an interactive graphic novel. So it incorporates sort of elements of a graphic novel, but it is entirely online, with the idea being that we can add, again, features like a document explorer or something, a pop-up explaining a particular topic. And this focuses on the story of a man named Kofi, who was enslaved by Adolf Phillips, who lived in New York City. And in 1741, there were a series of fires that spread across the city in the springtime that were blamed on an uprising of enslaved people. And Kofi was one of the people accused and executed. So this explores that story, again, looking at a specific group of people, how they, how slavery affected their experiences, how they resisted, what did they do, looking at them as a community, looking at them as people. This is the website where we have more of our education resources, including information about reserving on-site field trips, or some of the lesson plans, and eventually we will post the ones that you're going to hear about tonight, and also just sort of information about any other upcoming workshops that we are hosting. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Julia. Do y'all have another upcoming institute at all yet?
We've just submitted an application for 2025, so you can only do it in 2-year cycles. So this year is an off year for us, but we're hopeful for 2025. And that will be in person, actually, at our site. So we're excited about that.
Great, thank you. Well, now we'll pass it over to Maureen, who's gonna go through some basic how to use DBQs. Thanks, Maureen.
Thank you so much. That is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm just going to share my screen, and there we go. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with using document-based questions or teaching about slavery. I'm going to be specifically talking about how the two of them intertwine and come together. I want to start by just pointing out this is something I actually have stolen. This is not my original idea, but this is something I learned from Hassan Jeffries, who is a professor at the Ohio State University, and who I've had the pleasure and honor of working with a lot over the last 6 or 7 years. And he says, you know, what we need to know when you teach about slavery are 3 things. First of all, your history, meaning the history as much as we can know of enslavement in the United States. Secondly, you need to know your students. This is really important. It's at, of course, the heart of any kind of culturally responsive educational practice, but it's particularly important when we think about what they are bringing into the classroom in terms of ideas not only about the past, but about the present. And finally, you need to know yourself. Because as I have at the top here, you are not simply teaching about slavery as this historical institution that is over and done. In this country, you cannot teach about slavery without also addressing issues of race, what it means to live in a racialized society. and not only what it meant in the 18th and 19th centuries to live in a racialized society, but particularly what it means today to live in a racialized society. So it's really important that teachers examine their selves, your own experience with race as a racialized person. And I'd be happy to talk about that later if we have time and to answer questions, but that's kind of the real foundation here. Secondly, let's talk about DBQs. Why teach DBQs? Let me start with a thesis statement. DBQs are important for both school and life. Now, many people think of DBQs and the documents as just primary sources or antiquated primary sources, but in fact, they can be lots and lots of historical sources that tell us about what people were thinking and what they were doing in the past. In school, it's fairly obvious. And I just plucked these reading standards for literacy and history and social studies from the New York State framework, which, by the way, is an excellence framework and which you can use to support, if you're teaching in New York at least, you can really use to support both the use of local history, teaching about controversial topics, and the approach that we're taking, which is really to deal with the primary sources or with the historical sources. It's really clear when you look at this how important document-based questions are. Students are expected to be able to cite specific textual evidence, determine the central ideas or information of a primary or secondary source, analyze in detail events described in a text, determine the meanings of words and phrases. All of those things you have opportunities to do in a document-based question. So there's lots of reasons to do it in school and not simply for social studies and for history. This is also very important features of ELA and English. But I would add that the DBQ prepares students for life as well. Think about it. It's critical thinking. It can be a good way of analyzing, for instance, advertising, as I'm sure many students from the 1950s did with this ad. What's on social media? Learning to read documents is an important first step. It's not everything that's going to help you with the flood of misinformation, but it gives some very, very basic building tools. So, when your students say, why do we have to do this? You have lots and lots of reasons to do it. And it's not simply because it's on the test. So I'd like to talk about the basics with DBQs, and this is whether you are looking at a sensitive topic, a critical topic like enslavement, or whether you're looking at something like, what prompted a war. The basic element is the question or the prompt. And it's really important to know how to read it. When I was teaching AP US, and by the way, I was also a reader for the exam for many, many years, and also what was known as a table leader in those days, but this was in the last century, so I will tell you that it might be a little dated. But I don't think my advice is. Reading the question is the most important thing the students should do. Don't rush into it. And, I'm talking here about teaching with DBQs. We're not talking about using them as assessments because that's a completely different approach. But teaching with DBQs means that you're introducing the pieces one by one and you're allowing lots and lots of opportunity for students to grapple with the topic, discuss it with each other, and work their way through it. So I think it's an incredibly valuable use of classroom time to really unpack questions. What is the question asking you to do? Paying attention to nuance, clarify the question. And I also think it's really important to really start thinking in advance about what you're looking for in the documents, even without having seen them, because then you're reading the documents with purpose. The DBQ project, which is also a very valuable resource, calls this pre-bucketing. And it's the idea that you're going to, look at a question and say, I should be looking for X, Y, and Z. Misreading the question is one of the real pitfalls, and it's always really a sad pitfall when students misread the question and it's really high stakes. The classic example I remember from when I was teaching was there was an old DBQ question that said something along the lines of, although the colonies were, settled at different times by different groups with different motives and interests, by the time of the revolution, they had become more alike than different. And I would get really good essays that talked about how they were unified by the time of the revolution, but really didn't address the basic question of difference. And the fact is, you can be unified and not be the same. Typical prompts in DBQs, of course, are evaluate the extent to which something happened, evaluate the importance. Was this the most important factor, or were there others? Explain the causes, explain the reasons. And we want students to be really comfortable with that and be able to talk about that. If you're creating a DBQ, you want a question that is open-ended and one that can be answered legitimately in more than one way. That's really important. When, of course, a DBQ is being used as an assessment, students should really pre-bucket. If you're using a DBQ to introduce a topic, it's a little harder to do that. And when I think about pre-bucketing, I'm thinking about, think about a question like this. To what extent did the federal government facilitate the spread of slavery across the Deep South? And if I know something about the topic, I know that, okay, excuse me, there was the clearing of land, the basically displacement of Native Americans. That's the federal government at work, both the military and the political branches, and even the courts. There's the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act and other ways that the federal government assisted in protecting the so-called property rights of enslavers. There's the decision by Congress to end the international slave trade as was required in the Constitution, but the decision not to limit the interstate slave trade, the internal slave trade. So all of those are things I'm going to be thinking of in advance so that when I'm looking at the documents, I'm really looking with purpose. The next area for the DBQs is context. What do we already know? And I just illustrated that, but certainly about the time, about the people, about an event itself. The documents themselves, they are the heart, whether they're primary sources, as we traditionally think of them, maps, charts, or graphs that portray factual information, or indeed even artifacts. So some people prefer not to use the term primary sources, but to use the term historical sources. Either way, you can use a wide variety of items if you're constructing a DBQ. And you'll see that here in this, in the two lessons we're going to look at as well. Secondary sources can also be used in DBQs. It's a little bit trickier. It's usually important to pair them so that they have opposing interpretations. And in fact, that's often a key question now in the AP exam, is to have a paired free response question that pairs opposing interpretations. The basics when you look at a document, and this again is something that really should be practiced a lot with students in class, in pairs, in groups. What is the document? What does it say? What's the content? Who is speaking? Who created this message and why? What was their purpose? For whom did they create it? Who's the audience that they intended? And most importantly, and this is really, really important when we're talking about teaching about this topic, what doesn't it say? Are there unspoken assumptions that you as a teacher may know, but that you can help your students to see? Now, there's special care that you have to take with hard history. By the way, another phrase that I borrowed from Professor Jeffries. While I was at Teaching Tolerance / Learning for Justice, we created the Teaching Hard History Project, which is at its heart, a framework for teaching about slavery for grades K to 5 and 6 to 12. And we also have a podcast and enormous number of resources. Why is this history hard? Because it's emotional, because it's something that lots of people don't like to talk about. And so we call it hard history, but there are some very particular things that you have to look for. Language is one of them. The language is often obscured in documents dealing with slavery. It can sometimes be very harsh in documents dealing with slavery. And as a teacher, you need to be prepared to unveil the one and to help students confront the other. Point of view is particularly important, of course. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Inference, that whole what isn't being said here. What is being implied? What is the air around them that people don't even talk about, that they just assume everyone else knows? I think it's really important for teachers to help students reframe what they think they know and what they've been taught, and perhaps even what a textbook or other source is saying. And finally, debriefing is incredibly important. And that doesn't necessarily just need to be at the end of an exercise, but be something that that teachers need to be really aware of during any kind of lesson dealing with the topic of slavery and enslavement, of being kind of really a barometer of what's going on in the classroom and knowing when you have to stop and kind of ask what's going on in people's minds and also in their hearts. Clearly, what you need to do is create a safe space. But if some examples, language, for instance, you'll all recognize this, of course. This is from the Constitution of the United States. It is the infamous 3/5 clause. But, you know, what 3/5 of whom? Of other persons. So we really start at the very, very beginning using euphemisms instead of the words. And this is simply one example, but you may find, for instance, that the term servant is used instead of slave, that others are used, or any number of words. Watch out for. The other thing about language is that it's emotional. So that means it can be triggering. It can be offensive. Look at your sources that you're using in a DBQ carefully beforehand so that you can anticipate what those responses might be. And this is where knowing your students comes in, and that you're really ready to help them work through those experiences. Here's an example, of course, of point of view, and this is a fairly famous one. We're incredibly lucky that during the 1930s, the Works Progress Administration authorized the collection of slave narratives. It's an incredible collection where interviewers, mostly women, went through their local community in the South, recording narratives of people who had actually lived during the time of slavery. But there are problems with it. The main problem is that the women were primarily white women. They were usually women that did not work, which meant that they came from a stratum of society that was fairly well off. They were often, in fact, the descendants of the enslavers themselves. Even if they were not, they were creatures of the culture in which they lived. And so they brought all of those prejudices and narratives and beliefs into the interview with them. On the other side, you have Black people in the South living under Jim Crow who are being interviewed by these white women who are going to be extremely careful about how they answer those questions. So there's point of view going on both sides. Interestingly enough, Zora Neale Hurston was also one of the interviewers, so you can in fact find some of her narratives and actually find some narratives where the interviewers were people of color. The other thing that's been discovered recently about many of these women were many of them were daughters of the Confederacy, and daughters of the Confederacy were committed to the lost cause narrative. So as valuable as the slave narratives are, we have to be very, very careful. By contrast, we actually have first-person accounts, and the most famous of them, of course, is Frederick Douglass. There's the account of, I'm sorry, I've just forgotten the one about the woman who escaped and hid in the attic for so long, but others have emerged over the years, and certainly those accounts are very, very valuable. But again, they have a point of view. They may be, for instance, supporting the abolitionist movement. At any rate, use these with care. This, of course, the reframing. This is a fugitive slave ad. I hope that you're familiar. If you're not familiar, you should go to a website called Freedom on the Move, which is at Cornell University, where thousands of these ads have been digitized, and there are also some lessons around them. In fact, the Hard History Project worked on this. We can reframe this. That Freedom on the Move doesn't refer to these as fugitive ads. They refer to these as evidence of self-liberation. And that is a very different way to look at it. So anytime that you can help shift the lens about the traditional narrative that we've all been handed down, that's a great idea. Some other ways to do that, oh, and there's another one. This one actually is the sale, it's advertising a sale, but all of them, can be seen for what they don't say. So the advertisement of the sale, you can explore in terms of, okay, what does that mean for that individual person and for the family that they have? So reframing, some of it is as simple as words. Instead of referring to owners, use the word enslavers, if not every single time, at least some of the time. Plantations have such a romantic sense about them. They're forced labor camps in another way of looking at it. Fugitive, runaway, self-emancipation, because when you think of runaway, it's somehow illegitimate. They had no right to leave. But self-emancipation puts an entirely different light on it. They're freedom seekers. And the other thing to remember is, and Julie mentioned this, resilience, agency within a very limited sphere, but in fact, most enslaved people were able to exercise some degree of agency, and you want to look for that because it's a way to humanize history. That's kind of the introduction. I want to leave time for the actual lessons that Chuck and Imani have created, but I do have a few minutes left, I believe, maybe one or two, if there are any questions or comments. Harriet Jacobs, thank you, Jara.
Yeah.
Flew out of my head. I see that somebody has a question. Jara, will you handle the?
Sure, I think, yeah, you could just unmute Kevin. That's fine.
Oh, hi, Kevin.
Hi, thank you for this. This is really, really good. I'm wondering, so over the past few years, I've become more and more convinced that of the pedagogical method of explicit direct instruction, as opposed to like discovery-based learning. And in my mind, explicit direct instruction and DBQs can go hand in hand. They don't have to be contradicting, but I'd be curious, your thoughts to ask, like, can you teach DBQs explicitly, or does the nature of DBQs have to rely on sort of like students discovering things on their own, sort of a self-discovery path? I'm wondering what your thoughts are with that.
I will confess that explicit direct instruction was pretty much the way I taught when I taught. And so, yes, I think that you can. I still think there's a kind of a Socratic element to it, but I think that you can kind of go through documents. You can certainly model, it's the kind of thing I do, we do, you do, that can work. But you do at some point have to turn it over to them.
Thank you.
Jara, in the interest of time, why don't we move on?
Sounds great.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Maureen. All righty. Well, up next, we have Chuck, who wrote an amazing lesson using DBQs. So, Chuck, you want to take it away?
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
Perfect.
Hi, everyone. So this is, my presentation on the lesson I created with the historic Hudson Valley over the summer. And so hopefully this actually sort of addresses what Maureen was just talking about with DBQs and teaching them in a way that it's not necessarily so as much as just handing a packet over to the student saying good luck. As an AP teacher down in Florida, I always start off the year, no matter what level the students are at, whether they're experienced AP students or brand new to that kind of class, we always start this way with, sort of going through the steps of the DBQ together. So, so this DBQ lesson is focusing on slavery in the North, the evolution of slavery, primarily focused on the 17th and 18th century. But, so it's meant to be a prompt that asks about how slavery changes from the 17th to 19th century. And so we'll see here in just a moment. So, why a DBQ lesson? I've always thought, DBQs as an AP teacher, I'm expected to teach it. But even before I was teaching AP, I always liked what I saw with DBQs. It's a great way, as Maureen already talked a lot about it. It's just so fantastic in terms of helping develop very important skills for high school and for college and for life afterwards in their careers and so on. So I won't be, I'll, save time and not go over everything Maureen just talked about in that regard. But I will say that, even parents and other teachers who have been introduced to this kind of work have always been very appreciative and love these kinds of exercises. They love the kind of challenge that a DBQ can bring to help, stimulate and engage their child instead of just being, thrown a book to read or lectured at all day. It's a great way to help their child actually develop and, critical thinking skills and historical reasoning skills. So they love the challenge. So I've always liked it. And so why slavery? I mean, getting to work with historic Hudson Valley really was an amazing experience. I highly recommend to everyone who has not been to their teacher seminar to do so. And so it was a great opportunity for me to really get to learn more about slavery, especially seeing it, slavery in the North. And as as a kid who grew up in the South, slavery was rarely taught. It was sort of brushed over. And so it wasn't even really until college that I really got to fully learn about the institution and the atrocities of it and how that really worked. And now that I'm teaching, and especially in the state of Florida, it is very shocking to, for some of my colleagues to be told, you are to teach slavery in a very, very neutral state and even perhaps teach it as the state standards show here that slavery helped slaves develop skills and was a personal benefit to them. So it's become quite the controversy down in Florida. But so that's why I was very excited to make this lesson and use it for this year. So me, personally, right now I'm teaching AP, but I've taught at all levels. And so what I really like to do is I do this process where, and everyone's different, and teachers can feel free to use some of these steps, they can use all of them. Everyone's going to be different. So I'd like to introduce the themes, which I will show you in a moment here. I like to then have students practice writing the thesis statements with themes. And then we get into the actual document analysis for the DBQ. I introduce the actual DBQ essay and what that should look like, provide examples, go over the rubric that College Board provides. And then we actually do the student analysis. Many times we'll do at least the first couple of docs together as a class. That way, students who are brand new to this kind of activity are not just being left in the dark. And a lot of times they may be allowed to work with partners or groups. And eventually, of course, you do want them, at least for the AP level, to be able to do it individually. And then we get to writing everything. And we also even do the peer scoring. Now, just a quick note, again, every student is different. Every teacher is different. You as a teacher, you know your students best, you know their strengths. So you know your curriculum and your schedule, you know what's going to work for you. So with this lesson, the nice thing is that you're not required to necessarily do every single thing that I have in my curriculum, my lesson plan here. So I just wanted to make a note of that for everybody. And I made sure to put these in the official lesson. So when they are posted, everybody will be able to see them. But these are the actual history themes that College Board has provided and sort of encourage, American students to know and recognize as they are learning about, American history. And so I'm not going to go over each and every one of these now, but I do take the time with my students to go through them and introduce them so that they have a good understanding of them as we get into the lesson. This is one of my favorite activities. What I like to do with my students is at the end of a unit and to introduce them to a DBQ, we take those 8 themes and they get into groups and they're given approximately anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes to write a thesis statement, one for each theme. And then they write them up on the board, and it's essential because what they're doing is they're showing that in a quick amount of time, they're able to write great thesis statements. And at the end of the, match, I actually go and I decide which statement I like best. And the team gets a point at the end. Whichever team has the most points wins the game. So it's very competitive. They always love that. So it's always been a very successful, activity. That I have in my AP class personally. So then we get into the analysis, and this is where we actually get into the DBQ and the documents. So of course I introduce what does the analysis look like, and these are the things that College Board expects them to be able to do and understand. And I would recommend definitely using these for whichever level you're teaching at. So the next couple of slides just really quick show some of the documents I chose. And I want to be clear, all of these documents are from the Historic Hudson Valley's website, People Not Property. So again, just a great website. I definitely recommend using it. This image I definitely really liked because for my lesson and the fact that, it's a way for students to actually see, what the transatlantic slave trade looks like in a blueprint of sorts and how the slaves were seen as, how they were treated, and just they were seen by many as just livestock and a good to be, carried across. So I want students to see that and be able to use that in their essay. And then with Docs 4 and 5, it's important for students to be able to talk about the different parts of an argument. And so this allows them to talk about how with slavery, they're looking at how slaves had a chance to earn their freedom, whether it was purchasing, buying their freedom, or whether it was fighting in the American Revolution, which is a great topic and I always enjoy. So I definitely was excited to see that image on the website and get to use that in my DBQ. And then lastly, and again, there's 7 of them, but I'm only showing you a few of them to give you an idea. Document 6 is a written primary source, and it's an actual piece of legislation from the state of New York. So if you are especially, a teacher in the state of New York, also just a great little piece of your state's actual history. But for any teacher anywhere in the country, it's good for us to see and students to show that they understand northern states then began to, eliminate slavery. And that's going to be a big reason that we see sectionalism, of course, become, such a big part of the 19th century. And so that also, this table shows that as well. So just a great way for them to sort of see sectionalism and be able to use it now in their DBQ essay. So this is what I really wanted to make sure to show you, is the student analysis. And I actually had some students do this for me as a favor. And so this student put a lot of great work into this. So they, and I have them all do this on their first, assignment of the year anyway. So they have to, for each and every document, fill out point of view, audience, purpose, historical situation. And then, of course, they connect a historical theme with the document. So it really, that at least now going into this essay, they understand the documents and they at least have now significantly better chance of using these documents to support any argument that they are going to make. So here's my directions that I always give my students. And to be honest, most of these are pretty much just from College Board and what is expected for the AP, test in terms of the DBQ part. And so again, whatever level you're at, you can always use, every single bit of this. You can take out some parts, or you can even reduce the amount of documents that students are required to use. Every teacher can decide for themselves what's going to work best for their assignment or for their lesson plan. But that's just there for you to see. And again, that's in the lesson plan. Here's the prompt. The official prompt is: explain to what extent the institution of slavery transformed in the North from the 17th to the 19th century. And again, there at the bottom of that page on the bottom right is actually one of my students' written response to the prompt. And so as much as I would love to be able to just get more into this and go on a whole rant about, using this lesson and talking about slavery, I will, wrap up my bit here. And there's my contact info. And I just want to thank everyone for this opportunity and for coming and listening to me speak. Thanks.
Thanks, Chuck. I appreciate that. And like Julia said, these lessons are going to be posted on the Historic Hudson Valley Education site soon. We'll be sure to save everybody's email addresses that signed up and registered for tonight, and we'll let you know. We'll send you an alert when those are up on the site, just so you can go back and find their lessons, because it kind of talks you through step by step how to do that, do this activity with your students. All right, we're gonna pass it over to Imani.
All right, good evening, everyone. Let me just make sure I can go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so I've titled my presentation Learning History Through Discourse and Documents, and I am super excited to share my mini unit with you all. So my mini unit includes 5 different lessons, and so I am going to highlight specifically the 3 that are underlined and bolded here, but I did want to share with you all some of the titles of the other lessons here. So lesson 1 was looking at defining slavery, and I'll go into that a little bit. Lesson 2, looking at the Middle Passage. Lesson 3 is looking at the lives of the enslaved. Lesson 4 is looking at resistance and what could they do. And then lesson 5 is sort of what do we do now, bringing it to today. So lesson 1, defining slavery, is a 2-part activity. So students are actually going to get a chance to make posters based off of the People Not Property website. And they're going to create these posters looking at the various labor systems within the United States, within the colonial North. And then they'll end up using those posters to do somewhat of a gallery walk in which they'll fill out a graphic organizer. So I'll show you all what that looks like. So the People Not Property site, actually, Julia went through these a little bit, so I was happy about that. The labor systems, so we have Native Americans, Europeans, and then obviously the enslaved Africans. So the students will go through each one of these labor systems using the People Not Property site in order to make their posters. On the actual lesson plan I have, there is a poster template for the students to use. And then what they'll be able to do is use this graphic organizer, and with their peers, they're going to be able to do a gallery walk around the room, looking at the posters that the students have made to fill in this information. So what was the labor system? What was the effect on that group? And then what did resistance look like within those groups? I specifically like doing this obviously on paper, but if you do have a virtual classroom or your classroom is more virtual, you can do this virtually. I've done it where you put it into a Google folder and students sort of go through the Google folder posters looking through it that way. So you can do this either way. My lesson 2, this is going to be on the middle passage. And this lesson is, I love this lesson. It's actually from SHEG, or what is called DIG now. And so students will be able to actually look at different documents coming from the middle passage, both primary sources and some secondary sources there. And students will analyze the different documents using the questions from DIG, as well as some of the analysis sheets that I have here. So this is just what the process would be. We'd first read the document together. Our first document, I'd have the students complete the questions and source analysis. I want to make sure to model this for my students so that they're seeing exactly what we're doing with these documents and how they should be answering these questions. Then I actually break it up so students don't have all of the documents in front of them at one time. I put them into folders and have them pass it from table to table, and they'll have roughly about 10 minutes with each document. I see that this works better for like my on-grade and honors classes, whereas my AP classes, I may just give them all of the documents. But for my other students, I definitely like to give them time to analyze it and work with their table groups to understand the documents. So there are 5 documents in total for this specific lesson. We'll do one of them together, and then the other 4, they'll have time with their table groups to spend looking at these documents, and then they'll just rotate after those 10 minutes. And then one of the major parts of this is actually discourse. So having a discussion about the documents, what they have to say before we move on to an exit ticket or anything like that. This is an example of some of the questions that come from DIG. So sourcing, looking at where and when the textbook was written. Maureen talked about the fact that context is super important to understanding the documents. Also looking at language, the close reading question here, number 3. In the document, they use the word migrations. What does that mean? Why would they use that wording? That's something that I like to pull out with my students. What does that tell you about the point of view? All of those things are super important when understanding a document. I also wanted to include document A here so that you guys could understand what document it was. So this was actually from a Portuguese textbook. And so the students, having some prior knowledge, know that the Portuguese were the first to go and explore. And so they're going to understand a little bit more about what this was, or why the Portuguese textbook would have written it in this way, would have written this account in this way. The exit ticket for this lesson is actually looking at a poem on people, not property, an aria of pain. I had my students read this, or not read this, watch this video this year when we did this middle passage lesson, and they truly enjoyed being able to respond to the poem. I just asked them a simple question of, does this accurately describe the middle passage? After looking at the lesson, after being able to analyze documents, does it describe it? Why or why not? And it's a great way for students to get outside of that looking at documents mode and really be able to analyze, does a more contemporary piece actually respond to what the middle passage was? Lesson 3 is looking at the lives of the enslaved, and it does, once again, use the people not property site, and specifically looking at different aspects of lives of the enslaved. So each one of these links, the skilled labor, marriage, family, elders, community, each one of those actually goes to a link on people not property, and the students will be able to see real stories from individuals, enslaved individuals, and what their life looks like. I love graphic organizers, and so one thing I'm going to use for this lesson is looking at C-SPAN, and they have a wonderful graphic organizer there that looks at traditions, family, work, life. And so students will be able to sort of explore with their table groups, the people not property site, looking at these different links, and then put all that information together into a graphic organizer in which they'll be able to really analyze what life was like for those of the enslaved. For this exit ticket, it's another sort of fun way to get all this information. They're going to do a definition poem or a traditions quilt square. So the definition poem is just looking at how would you define enslavement in colonial America here, or they could do a quilt project where they basically would put words or pictures and colors to represent what it would have looked like within these places and for these individuals. Lesson 4 is looking at resistance and what could they do. And there is a time at the end for the exit ticket to look at some of the WPA slave narratives that Maureen was talking about earlier. So this is what this part of People Not Property looks like, this part of the site. And so it actually is sort of a simulation. Students will be able to choose their different prompt. So if it says if enslaved individuals, they could choose A, B, or C, and it will bring them to a different situation each time. It builds on each other for 3 times, and then it gives them the final product of what actually happened. So in this one, it just goes through each one, and the final product of this was Cuffy, looking at 1741, the 1741 rebellion. So students would be able to go through each prompt, make their choices, record it, and then they'll be able to actually see a real life example of what those rebellions or what resistance movements looked like based off of the People Not Property site. And this is an example of what the end would be like from that simulation there. And so they'll actually be able to get information from what happened, and they'll be able to record it on their graphic organizer. This is part of the WPA slave narratives, and I chose one that came out of Howard County, Maryland, because that is where I work. And so I wanted to make sure that the students, they felt like this was applicable to where they lived. I highly suggest that any teacher who does use the WPA narratives find something that, or find an interview that is from where they are stationed at. I think it's important for students to see themselves within the narrative or see where they're living within this narrative. And so I chose one of an enslaved person who ended up self-emancipating. And lesson 5 looks at reparations, and it starts off with looking at Ta-Nehisi Coates' testimony, and then going into a lesson in which students would actually, at the end of class, have a reparations bill in which they would have all of their ideas of what should actually a reparations bill actually look like. This is adopted from the Zen Project, and so students, it's an adopted lesson from them, and so they'll be able to, again, make a bill that encompasses all the ideas that they had. And then just some basic benefits and tips. Everyone's already gone through these, but benefits of doing DBQs. Definitely deepens understanding for students, promotes inquiry and analysis, encourages critical thinking, and fosters historical empathy. Students will actually be able to get real life examples of understanding this history. Some tips. I definitely think that it's important to model document analysis, even if it's just one document. It helps students to understand what they should be doing once they are sent off on their own to do that work. Provide scaffolded support. I am always going to give my students some type of specific questions or guided questions that will help them through the documents. Utilize a graphic organizer. I love being able to chart the information that we go through together so that students, they are telling me what they learned, and also they're able to have it all in one place. Promote collaboration and discussion. I think it is super important for students to be working together on these documents, because as they're talking to their teammates or their table mates, they're able to think of new ideas that maybe they wouldn't have thought of on their own. And reflect and debrief. A huge part of the lessons that will be posted, I have discussion questions for every single one of these lesson plans, because I think it's super important to make sure that you are actually discussing the documents with your students, not just letting them leave with an open-ended idea, letting them be able to fully formulate how they're feeling about the documents or answering the question. And this is my email. Please feel free to contact me. And thank you all so much for letting me present tonight.
Thanks so much, Imani. Let's see if I can see everybody again. Great. Thank you all so much for sharing. Well, we do have some time for questions, and you can type those in the chat or feel free to unmute. One thing that I was wondering, maybe Maureen or Imani or Chuck, I know we have some teachers in the webinar tonight that teach younger kids. And I was just thinking about DBQs and using this type of thinking. How would you adapt that for like middle or elementary school? Is that something that is easily adaptable using the same? I mean, I think the concepts are great. I just wanted to ask about that. What do you think, Maureen? Or Chuck or whoever?
I think that, first of all, it's perfectly okay to adapt a source to make sure that it's accessible to students. I think that you want to start small so that you really might work on one or two pieces. And, even at this point, virtually every middle school social studies program, whether it's online or an old-fashioned textbook, includes excerpts of original documents. So I would suggest taking the time to do really what Imani does, which is to model how to analyze it and to really discuss it, build from 1 to 2. Now, the other thing, and maybe to 3. The other thing to keep in mind, you mentioned elementary school is, and something I didn't mention before is, one of the jobs you have as a teacher by the time you get to high school is unteaching what they've learned before, especially about this particular topic. So in elementary school, I think it's really important to kind of really stay to the basics. Like, before you start teaching about slavery, talk about freedom. Think of what does it mean to be free? How important is it to make your own choices in life? When elementary school students are going through when you're talking to them about, bodily integrity and privacy, that's something kind of to bring back when you talk about this. I'm always disturbed by the fact that, virtually every kindergarten in the nation celebrates Harriet Tubman. And yet no state addresses slavery before 4th grade in the standards. So what exactly is Harriet Tubman doing? And what is this thing? So you really have to develop ways to talk about it. And my recommendation there is the Teaching Hard History Framework, which I think does a really good job of the early grades.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, Ellen had a question, and then maybe after we have a question in the chat too. Ellen, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. Rather than using the WPA documents, I prefer to use material from Documenting the American South on the North Carolina website. And the two documents I use primarily are Solomon Northup's Odyssey and the story of Venture Smith. Unlike Solomon Northup, is a free man who was kidnapped, sold into slavery in the Deep South. So his story is a free man's view of the horrors of slavery, but he also discusses plantation slavery and he discusses the culture of African Americans. Venture Smith writes his memoirs. One of the issues is that the South dismissed the slave narratives, claiming they were done by abolitionists. The Venture Smith makes claims in his narrative that are actually confirmed in a runaway slave ad that was posted by his enslavers trying to get him back. So it's a very valuable source because we can compare his account with the claims made by the enslaver, which support everything that Venture Smith said. So those are the two narratives I prefer to use. And I want to thank people for presenting excellent presentations.
It's really good. Excellent. I saw that Kevin, you wrote in the chat and just mentioned that both Imani and Chuck talked a little bit or alluded to the fact that their students responded well, and you're hoping to hear a little bit more about that. So, Imani and Chuck, could you share a little bit more just about how students responded to your lessons?
Yeah. I think specifically for the middle passage lesson, I do that one almost every year. I teach world history, so I teach on grade honors AP as well. And so with my students with that one, I loved the fact that they were almost like shocked by the fact of they were using some of the wording that they were using. Even in the Portuguese textbook, they were like, oh my gosh, Miss Hinson, they're literally like not giving any credit to what was happening in the slave trade. And I'm like, yeah, guys, like that's exactly what they're doing. And so I love when the students are pulling out some of those words, like the migrations, instead of saying like, these individuals were kidnapped from Africa and brought over. I love how they're pulling out those words. So I think the biggest thing that I'm seeing out of it is more like the shock from my students when they read some of the documents, but then using that to get a true understanding of like what the middle passage was like.
And so I'll just say with my lesson, like I said, I think for just the overall lesson itself, I have students that are very appreciative. They respond well because I have students that are brand new to AP and or have never experienced DBQ before, whether because I've taught it with honors before as well. Or even students who are experienced with DBQ kind of work. Afterwards, they're like, I really appreciated the chance to, do this because I felt like it was a very directed way to help me understand how I might approach this and so on. And I think the activities we do, like the one where you saw the picture of them running on the board, even whether it's high schoolers or middle schoolers, or elementary school kids, they still love competition. They still love games. They still want to try and be the best. So when I give students a chance to say, okay, well, whoever can write the best statement, and they love having me be like the judge, they have no problem criticizing me, saying, "Oh, ours was better. You should have chose ours." But they at the same time they really do like it. So anything you can do with something like even like at least for me, speaking on my DBQ lesson, that is somewhat engaging, and then maybe even incorporating some kind of competition into it, they always, I would say 95% of the time, they respond very well to it, and are appreciative of it.
Thank you. That's great. And then Imani, I saw you wrote in the chat just that your lessons are geared towards 9th through 12th. Perfect. And then just like Chuck said, everything's adaptable.
One other thing that came to my mind as you all were sharing is just the importance, and you touched on this, Maureen, at the beginning of your presentation, of us as teachers really preparing ourselves and doing our work to be prepared to teach these harder topics. And could you all just go into kind of your own maybe like prep work, even communicating with parents or kind of keeping parents in the loop about what you're teaching in class. Thank you, Alan. I appreciate what you shared tonight. Thanks for being on. But just wondered if y'all had any feedback. I know we have some resources in the resource guide. Let's Talk from Learning for Justice is a great guide. But I just wondered if y'all could speak to that for a few minutes, just about kind of some of the self-preparation for leading these conversations.
I think it is super important. Alan actually was my undergraduate teacher. So he taught me how to be a teacher. And so one thing that he always emphasizes the fact that you need to have questions. And so something that I have done a lot of every time I go through the document is like, how could I teach this to how can I question my students to get them to the point that I'm trying to get them to, or to get them to understand the document more? And so I'll always have some back pocket questions for each document that I can sort of help students to pull the context out or pull the point of view out. And so definitely reading through each document and then setting a list of questions for myself that I can ask students that will help them get to the main argument of the document.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Do we have any other questions or comments before we sign out? Well, Chuck, Imani, Maureen, you want to say any final words?
I would just say that, first of all, Chuck and Imani's lessons are just wonderful, and thank you so much for those presentations. I kind of want to be in your class, but
Yeah.
some people just never grow out of wanting to be a student.
True.
I know that some folks are in places where they're worried about being challenged for teaching this kind of history. And so one of the things that I included in the list of resources were some really good resources for helping communicate with parents and with other stakeholders about why this is important. And also just links to resources for that kind of support.
Great, thank you. Yes, and we had a question about middle school lessons, and we will have a middle school teacher on our webinar next week as well. And all of these lessons will be on the Historic Hudson Valley teacher site soon. So, Chuck and Imani, any final words? Yes, Denise, elementary as well. In 2 weeks, we have a great lesson all about Columbus and colonialism and how to teach that to elementary students. So we have an elementary teacher from the Summers Institute coming on, and then also Sarah Shear, who's a great presenter and knows a lot about how states are teaching teaching colonialism well and not well. So that'll be really engaging and really targeted towards elementary school. All right, Chuck.
So I just want to, just thank everyone for coming and, at least listening to me and my bit. But, I think that, and I think everyone that's here with me would agree that this is a, very important topic for us to discuss. And at least for myself in the state of Florida, it's definitely become a topic that is almost discouraged to be taught in the classroom, which has been very upsetting. So, as teachers, it's sort of been put on our shoulders to make sure that this, topic and this history, this past isn't just simply swept under the rug. And so, for all those teachers and educators that are here or just here to learn, I just want to, thank you for being a part of that and, encouraging me at least to, keep on, keep on the fight and keep on discussing this topic within the classroom. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Chuck. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just echo Chuck. It's obviously hard being a social studies teacher right now, but we love the work, so that's why we do it. So thank you all so much for coming.
Yes. Thank you all so much. And we do have 2 more webinars coming up in the next couple of Tuesdays. So join us again. And thank you so much, Maureen and Chuck, Imani, Julia, Nicole, everybody for being on, and just appreciate you all. And reach out if you have any more questions or want to talk more about these topics. I know Imani and Chuck shared their information, and I know would be eager to have more conversations. So y'all have a great night. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.